Well, good morning. This is the third week of my lectures after the introduction, and I want to explore, before we go into looking at some detailed products, I want to help you out with some of the design elements. I picked up on some of these in the actual lecture last week in the online section, and I want to provide it all in this format and lead into discussion about how you're going to run your projects or how you might run your projects. So last week I touched on some of the ways about we can understand this interaction between having forestry and agriculture on the same land. And there's different ways and interpretations. So if you're looking at different products and agricultural systems, you can start exploring whether they're complementary or competitive, and where that competition occurs and what's the nature of that competition, to help you design the systems about whether you want the trees very close together with the agriculture or whether you want it further apart. Now, the importance of this is in this diagnosis emphasized. A lot of agroforestry systems are promoted about these elegant combinations of trees and agriculture. They only tell you the end point. They don't go back to the basics and start looking about whether it's actually optimal to have them closely coupled together. And that can depend on farming systems, machinery, labor costs, and all these other elements that are unique to each particular farm. So if something works in South America, applying that same system by measurement in an Australian landscape is pretty irrational, really, given the very different economics and the different market opportunities and labour structures and legal issues and planning and all these things. So I want people to go back to basics. And the basics we talked about with shelter was about what role the trees have in supporting agricultural systems through shelter, and where the competition and where the production benefits are achieved. So you can understand that interaction and start designing unique systems in some way, where you can look at some sort of combination of trees in belts and the agricultural system. You can look at the negatives, how far the competition affect, how much land is lost from production, where the positive impacts are, and how you can actually design systems so they maximize the positives and control the negatives in some way. One example was when looking at salinity in irrigation systems. We have rising water tables as shown by this high flag under a productive irrigation paddock here. Underneath the trees, we have a very low water table because the trees have lowered that. So salinity is being controlled under the trees, but you can't produce agriculture under the trees. So there's no benefit from actually having trees spread right across this farming landscape, which is intensive agriculture. But you may be able to design the system where you have a block of trees and you use a water pump to lower the water table, as they're doing in the irrigation areas, bring the water to the surface and pass it over land and feed it onto the trees, possibly even increasing tree growth as a result, as long as the buildup of salt doesn't become an issue. So there are management solutions to minimize the negative and maximize the positive of these things. So in essence, what I alluded to was, don't start thinking of systems as produced from a research perspective off farm, where you can design the perfect system and then promote it to farmers and say, well, you should be taking a certain paddock out of production, single product, you should be putting it into a combination like alley farming or agroforestry is presented in some landscapes. Don't do that, because I don't think it works. We take a more planning approach with the actual landholders and the families, exploring local markets, risks and uncertainty, and then work out where a farmer might put their resources in the first year, and suggested that maybe in many cases it's best to put a belt of trees around the block, because half the negative impact is actually on other land, neighbours, or even public land or roadsides. And the risk to the landholder is not very high. And over time, they build confidence, and then they start searching, as Andrew said, identifying niches in the landscape, such as watercourses, then possibly linking up those to get this network of shelter and biodiversity. And you start getting a more sophisticated landscape, as we saw with both examples of farmers we've met. So that design approach is what we're looking for in your project. Another way I explored about how to understand the combinations was look at joint production functions, where you have two products produced, whether on a farm or in a factory. And between producing 100% of product one or 100% of product two, whether this is all agriculture, this is all forestry, there is a production frontier. Theoretically, for much of it. A great deal of research would be required to work out exactly where the line goes, but you can understand that there may be opportunities in there. And I want to explore some examples of that, where a combination of the two may be more profitable than one alone. To introduce it, I talked about this white cypress pine and farming and grazing systems, native trees in central New South Wales, saying if you reduce the number of trees in this landscape, you lower the wood production. It's a very good quality termite resistant timber, but you're likely to increase agriculture. Is it better to have all forestry, all agriculture, or a combination like this of the two in that landscape? And someone did a joint production function many years ago to look at what the effective percentage of open paddock agriculture production and the amount of timber produced. Now, if a farmer has no interest in trees and no interest in timber, well, it would suggest from that research that they shouldn't have any trees in that paddock. But maybe there's a combination of the two that will be best. And this doesn't account for the benefits that this paddock might provide in terms of shelter, soil erosion control, water table management, and biodiversity, which may actually enhance the tree values down this line. So I want to explore some examples. I use the boot and belt factory as a way of understanding how for the same amount of inputs, the same land, the same labor base, the same knowledge, that you could actually produce a combination of two products from a single enterprise, such as a farm, and that this production frontier that has these combinations, and that depending on the prices or the profit generated from each one, it may be that the best combination is not to produce all boots or all belts or all forestry or all agriculture, that the best combination may actually involve compromising one of these products. And this is an important point because in a lot of farming systems, there is a priority, such as a dairy farm. They want to maximize dairy milk production and will only have trees until the point at which it actually starts reducing production. So let's say this is dairy production up here, increasing tree cover along here. They would only come to this point here because any amount of extra tree planting would result in a decline in dairy production, and that would be considered unacceptable into that landscape. But as this does show, if that's the nature of the joint production frontier, then you've actually got this opportunity to have tree cover up to some percent, which has no impact on agriculture. We saw that in the Stewart example in some way. In this boot and belt example, I'm suggesting, depending on the profit generated from each product, a compromise on one may actually generate a greater return than producing one or the other solely. And that could be quite an important point. In agricultural economics, or in economics generally, looking at these joint production frontiers, I've suggested that it's for the same amount of resources, same land, same labor force. If you invest in fertilizer or invest in watering or invest in changing the paddock, you can move that frontier in some way. I've just put that in there as a point of clarification. But for this exercise, we're really just interested in how these two combine. Also in economics, I refer to the fact that the price will determine what the optimum combination is. And say this is a production frontier for product B and product A, there will be a line that determines where upon that frontier is the most economical place to operate. And that would depend, as I use the boot and belt example, about what's the relative value as perceived by the producers of those two products. Now, product A here and product B, this is a red line. The red line shows if you produce this product A, you'll get this return, which will be equal to producing this much of product B. So you can see immediately that you have to produce more product B to get the same revenue as product A, so that the gradient of this line will be naturally tilted down to preference those combinations or those production systems that produce more product A. But in this example, given that shape of equal cost production line, you can see that the best combination will be the point way out here where you maximize the balance of revenue from a combination of having the two. So bearing that in mind, we can start looking at some cases. There are production frontiers that are shaped in different ways, and I want to use some examples like this. A and B here. If the production line curves this way, we put a price line on, and the best option will be the one where it actually maximizes only product A or only product B, depending on which produces the greatest return. So this gradient of this price line will vary depending on the relative revenue generated by A or B. If B produced more revenue, the line would be tilted more steeply, and it would hit this point as being the furthest away from the origin, and that would be suggesting that the farm should only produce one product and not a combination of the two. So this is a joint production function that is very competitive. If you're producing product A and you want to produce a little bit of B, you have a dramatic impact on the amount of A you can produce, and equally for this part of the curve. So where you see a production frontier that's convex like this, it would suggest that the farm shouldn't be mixing those two values or products together at all. And that just shows if product B was worth more. Related to this is this notion of the land equivalent ratio. This is essentially how much is being produced from the same land. If I can use the Stewart's example again, Andrew said that he's got 17 or 18% of the farm under trees, but his agricultural production is still the same. So if you look at production from the combination over production alone for the agriculture component, this is the forestry component, he's getting 18% from the forestry component, he's getting 100% from the agriculture. So his land equivalent ratio is over 1. It's 1.18 in a sense. He's getting 1.2 thereabouts. He's producing the amount of product, he's producing up to almost 20% more product from the same amount of land. And that's where this land equivalent ratio comes in. So looking at the joint production function, if you put a straight line between forestry and agriculture, in terms of this is 100% agriculture, this is 100% forestry, and you start adding that. Anything that's got out above this, the land equivalent ratio will be greater than 1, and anywhere down here it's less than 1. And I'll use a couple of examples to illustrate that. Say this might be the Stewart example, for example. Oh no, this is a forestry example. 90% forestry, 30% agriculture, a land equivalent ratio of 1.2. So they've reduced their forestry production by 10%, but in doing so, we're able to increase their agricultural production 30%. This might be grazing in amongst the trees or something like that. Let's look at some of these joint production function curves, because they're quite logical when you look at some examples. Let's think of large-scale industrial forestry, where you put the trees in to maximize forestry production, but in doing so, there is no agriculture on that site. So if you look at a 100-acre farm, for example, it could be 100 acres purely under forestry or 100 acres purely under agriculture. Now, as soon as you put 60 acres under forestry, that frees up 40 acres for agriculture production. So they're perfectly competitive because the land equivalent ratio is always 1. Any increase in forestry will mean less agriculture, and they're perfectly replaceable in that combination. That's a very common scenario where you're looking at any sort of enterprises where producing one means you just got to take out the other by the equivalent amount, and that's perfectly competitive. That is a common understanding of how forestry and agriculture might work. And it may be that on a farm, it's not a bad combination to have some forestry, some agriculture, because you diversify agriculture production and maybe you reduce the risks of the farming enterprise. But they are still perfectly competitive in that way of understanding them. So that's not to suggest this is not a good practice, it's just a way of understanding the two. I alluded to the convex curves, where a small amount of, say you've got an agricultural farm here, you start adding a few trees, it drops very, very quickly. And there can be many reasons for that, because adding a new enterprise to a farming system may be taking resources and time away from the management. There may be a lot of conflict between them, or the cost of having a few trees and fences is just so high that the forestry return doesn't offset it. And at this end, you might have a forestry operation, all trees, all producing conservation values, and you want some agriculture. Introducing a few sheep or goats destroys the forest. So they're very competitive systems. And again, as I said before, in highly competitive systems, when the land equivalent ratio is less than 1, you're likely going to be forced into a scenario of choosing, you either plant trees or either you have agriculture, but a combination of the two at the farm level is not likely to be a rational decision. Compare that with a curve which is out here, a curve which is leaning out here. In the sense, you can see immediately you put the curve out away from the straight line, the land equivalent ratio becomes greater than 1. For example, this might be the Stewart example here. Well, it's not actually, because it's 100% agriculture. You reduce that by 20%, but in doing so, you provide 30% of the forestry values. So the land equivalent ratio becomes greater than 1, or 1.1, because you're adding those two together in some way. There are some interesting theoretical opportunities. Imagine a scenario where you can have a farm, you start adding trees, and you have no impact on agricultural production, and it just goes up and up and up. In fact, you can have 100% tree cover and still have 100% agriculture. Clearly, it may be possible up to a certain point, but there will be a point at which that starts impacting. And this is something for nothing. This is the Stewart example. So they've got 100% agriculture, they'll be able to maintain that by improved farming practices, and they've got 17 or 18% forestry, and they've been able to get that without any impact on agriculture. We call this supplementary, and this is one of these niches Andrew's been looking for. If he's able to plant trees in an area that doesn't produce anything in terms of agricultural value, then he's not losing anything by planting trees there, he's gaining something. Or if his shelter is actually able to offset the negative impact of the trees and the land they occupy and the cost of doing it, the shelter benefit means that it's compensated for. He's getting his trees there for no impact on agriculture. And you may, if you're in the tree planting game at the other end, think of scenarios where you've got forestry, whether it's for conservation or profit or timber production or whatever, and you start adding a little bit of agriculture, or a little bit of tourism, or a little bit of something else to the system, and you have no impact on the amount of forestry production or value up to a certain point where it starts impacting. Well, I alluded to tourism as a possibility there. This could be a scenario where you're producing timber or seed or other products from a forest, but then you have recreation values as well. And up to a point, the recreation values do not mean that you have to compromise the forestry in some way up to a certain point. So you can have supplementary or niche opportunities. And these are the easiest areas to work with producers, because like I mentioned with the dairy farmers, they're producing milk. They don't want to compromise their milk production. It's what they know, what underpins their economy. So if you can look at an opportunity to fitting some trees into the landscape for conservation benefits, soil erosion, or timber production, or any other product, you're working at the margins, you're working at the niches, particularly when you start. And that's an important point, because if you start well and you build up confidence and the landholders start recognizing some opportunities, they may be prepared in the future to plant much more. Whereas if you start working up here and say, this is the optimum combination, and the farmer says, well, I'm not going to do that because it requires that I reduce my agricultural production, and they're not going to do that. You can think about tree growing as a journey rather than an endpoint. And again, too much agroforestry research has been focused on these optimum endpoints, but they haven't thought about how the farming community is going to get from where they are to that point over time. Complementary, this is the holy grail, where a farm is producing 100% agriculture, adding some trees into the system somehow increases agricultural production or the profit from agriculture, reducing the costs. This may be if you're in a very exposed landscape and shelter is reducing agriculture profitability, having some shelter belts may actually increase agricultural production up to some point. Now, that's not going to continue up here. If you start planting trees more and more, as we've seen, more and more shelter trees eventually start compromising agricultural production, and it'll go competitive for a period of time back. It'll move back because it has to get back to this point over here. At the forestry end, I've seen some examples where plantation forestry companies in New Zealand suffered from severe weed infestations of pampas grass that was affecting their production. And the forestry companies said, well, let's fence out some of these areas, put in some water points, and introduce cattle underneath the trees. And as a result of that, they reduced their tree management costs and their weed control costs, and they increased tree growth by controlling weeds. So they found that a little bit of agriculture in their forest actually provide a complementary gain of increasing forestry production or profitability as a result of that. And that may come through also for many sites around the world of having fire protection. I would argue my farm is more like a forestry farm with agriculture, and the Stewart farm is an agricultural enterprise with forestry. And in both cases, we're looking for this complementarity where I get weed control and fire protection and nutrient management by having some stock on the property, but the agricultural component is small in terms of its return because they're adjusted stock, whereas Andrews and Jill are mainly focused on fat lamb and wool production. They get the gain in terms of a few tree products and tree values like biodiversity and soil erosion. And the timber production, they often talk about as being a bonus on top of that, where in our place, it's more focused on the production of the timber. Fodder is a good example. Fodder production from trees could be a byproduct of producing trees for shelter or some other values. Fodder can get you through drought periods or an annual feed shortage. If we look at forestry as this component up here, you can think about some of those examples where a little bit of fodder tree can actually increase agricultural production in the complementary way. And those trees might also be controlling land degradation or providing biodiversity and potentially timber. But fodder is the reason for this increase in agricultural production because you're able to avoid having to sell stock during a drought. It may only happen once every 10 years, but the agricultural gain can be quite significant. So those sort of examples, those niches, those production advantages of having the combination are some of the sort of things you want to go looking for when you start doing a design project on a property, because it reduces risk and focuses on their existing enterprises supporting that, rather than having to introduce the complexity of a whole new enterprise which compromises your existing production systems. There are very competitive ones. I call them incompatible. A combination of trees and agriculture which just destroys both effectively. So let's look at this. We've got 100% forest. You introduce agriculture and there's a dive in the amount of forestry you get. And that could be certainly an example of, say, introducing sheep into a forest when the sheep destroy the trees or destroy the market for the trees or do something, their marketability or the quality, ring barking the trees. In the other case where 100% agriculture, a farmer plants a few trees and they work out they're poisonous to agriculture or something. So your agriculture production plummets. Again, quite clearly, this is a very negative land equivalent ratio. A combination of the two is impractical or irrational or uneconomic, and you wouldn't do it. There are some interesting cases where forestry and agriculture may be very, very incompatible, and these are worth identifying in some way. So wherever we produce two different products, fodder and cropping, pasture and getting salinity benefits in trees, biodiversity and timber from a forest, there is this notion of a production frontier, a combination of the two. Now, in your project, you might start exploring where are these potential gains and potential negatives and potential gains? What's the sort of theoretical nature of the curve? Research is, you'd have to do years of work to try and work out what the combination is, but intuitively there are potential benefits. And I talked about timber and biodiversity being potentially supportive of each other when they're operating in a riparian strip. For example, biodiversity and water quality in a riparian strip may be actually improved by having a small amount of timber production. And this is where we're operating in that riparian strip. We're not doing 100% timber production because clearly that might impact on biodiversity values. So you can start exploring where some of these combinations exist. If you look around the world, This is the Tonga system that was developed in Burma by the colonial rubber growers from the British. They put in the rubber plantations, and they worked out that, having forced the locals off the land probably, that if they invited their landless people on to grow their crops in between the trees, the rubber trees, they could actually increase the rubber production by controlling the aggressive grasses, tropical grasses in there. So they found that in a rubber plantation, a small amount of food production could actually increase the rubber production. So here we've got a company solely interested in rubber, leaning towards and encouraging a agroforestry system that has food production in it because it benefits the rubber. Socially, you could argue it also benefits the food producers. They get access to land they otherwise have. So the agreement tends to be the landless people or the farmers can crop anything between the young rubber trees without, as long as they maintain a weed strip along the trees. And I saw that, I took this photo in Vietnam, I think, at a rubber company that was allowing that to happen. Grazing in young plantations produces management costs, another potential in a pulpwood plantation where you combine a little bit of wool production, agriculture, you can actually increase that. Again, even if you're not interested in getting any return from agriculture, the benefits come from controlling the fuel load, the weeds, maintaining access, and maintaining fire breaks in some fashion by allowing a neighbour to graze in amongst the trees for no cost. And so the pulpwood company might benefit from that. Biodiversity is a way of supporting agriculture production. A couple of good examples. This one down here, I'm particularly interested in northern Queensland, the sugarcane production. They suffer from problems with a cane rat that harbours, winters over and eats the grass, tropical grass seeds. And in this case, the farmer is using tropical plantation timbers to suppress the grasses, and in doing so reduces grass seed production in the area around the cane, and that controls the cane rat in there. So you can see that there's a potential positive benefit from having a little bit of biodiversity and maybe timber production in terms of increasing that. Again, the key to discovering these opportunities is to look at the production system, look at the sugarcane production system and see what the threats are to that, see what's affecting production, and ask the question, can we actually introduce trees somewhere in the vicinity, if not in amongst the crop itself, in a way that offsets that negative impact or reduces the management costs to increase agriculture? And I think through that example, you can see you have to actually start not with the trees, but with the farming system. And that's what we want you to do in that diagnosis example. And the same thing with fodder in some fashion. This is another example that highlights it's more than just the production system. This is an apple orchard. I visited one of our master tree growers in Western Australia, and his sole intent is to grow apples. In growing apples, he needs a work crew. It's quite a large orchard, work crew, but he can only employ them in the apples for 8 or 9 months of the year. He's found that if he let the workers go for the 3 months, he had trouble re-employing them. So he decided he would employ them on the farm, planting trees on the areas that he can't grow the apples and managing those trees during those 3 months. And in doing so, he was able to maintain an experienced and productive workforce. So in a sense, he was producing apples alone and had unproductive land. He was able to introduce some forestry into that, and from that use up better utilization of his labor resources. And effectively, it didn't cost him anything because he had to just keep them busy after they did all the cleaning the sheds and maintaining the equipment and other things. He was able to utilize them in producing a forestry crop. So the niche that you're looking for may be a bit sort of hidden below some of the management structures, which highlights why it's important to do a good diagnosis, not just in the paddock, but also with the landholders about their farming system and their resources and what they're doing. So we're looking at any sort of opportunity we can find to get more trees into the landscape for that combination, because in doing so, we may meet some of our broader public goods of climate change adaptation, or sequestering carbon, or increasing biodiversity, whatever motes you promote, encourages you or your company or the government or the stakeholders. And I want to look a bit about stakeholders a little bit later, about how they can actually do that. But let's consider we're interested in helping farmers increase and maintain and make their farming systems more resilient over time, and get enhanced production from these combinations. Where in open pasture situations, some trees might increase agriculture. In a tree covered area, some agriculture might reduce the costs of the trees. There will be a competitive phase between them. And if you just start talking to landholders about you should be producing this much forest cover, they'll say, well, I'm not prepared to do that. And that's what we've seen so much of in the way farm forestry is promoted. It's promoted as an alternative land use that it's ridiculous, because landholders aren't going to take that up because of the risks. And I'll talk a little bit about that with the economics a little bit later. So the forest values are much more than just timber, the biodiversity, recreation, the aesthetics and other things. And for many landholders, and this is an early photo of Andrew Stewart riding his horse through the paddock, it may be these non-wood values that actually entice them to want to move up and increase their tree cover. But in terms of, in doing so, why not manage the trees, prune them up, to keep this opportunity of getting a timber return available in the future? And as you'll see a little bit later in the economics, Andrew talks about the timber being a bonus on top of these other values. And that's a really important design question about how you manage the recreation, shelter, biodiversity design to make the opportunity to get a commercial product out of the other end, because it's often down the track, of course, may encourage us to plant more for the system. Where a landholder operates, particularly at this end of the spectrum, will vary with their confidence in the future values. Now, initially, a farmer may have no confidence that they'll be able to produce timber, so they'll be down this end where the focus is on increasing the grazing production. But as their confidence in the timber increases over time, they might have started with 10% of the farm and started finding, well, red ironbark grows really well and the market for red ironbark timber is really good. They'll start planting a little bit more, and they may over time be prepared to compromise some of their grazing or agricultural production because they can start seeing the value of that. And again, that relates back to that question I said, where do you start? You could do all the research in the world and start promoting a combination of forestry and agriculture, which you argue is most economical, and expect the farmer to put 100% of their farm under it in 1 year, or paddock by paddock. Or you can look at them right down this point where they are and saying, where do I plant the next tree to get the first benefit? Where do I plant the first hectare of trees? And you'll see that that interest in the first hectare, the design of that might be very different to what goes in 10 or 15 years later at the 10th hectare. And I've enjoyed watching over the last 30 years of our members in this area, how their interests change and how they become more confident and they redesign systems. But the important point is that first tree has to address the values at that particular time. So you're going to use real case examples or make up case examples for your design project. I want you to explore the next tree, not the optimum, not the 30-year plan, but a way to actually start moving around and getting more trees into the system in some way. Cropping is a really good example. Cropping, particularly in a industrialized country where labor costs are high, is dependent on large machinery, and in the temperate area, it depends on high sunlight levels. So you often find that a small amount of tree cover, if shelter is a limiting factor, may increase crop production, but there's a very competitive effect because of the costs of planting and harvesting the seed. Any impact on productivity, plant growth and seed set, as soon as that starts to decline, the economies of crop production drop dramatically because it costs the same to plant and harvest because it's an area-based system. So therefore it can be very competitive. And it's unlikely that if you've got a forest area, you're going to be able to crop anything underneath the trees. In other countries where labor costs are extremely low, And in the tropics where solar energy is high and moisture is often available, you can find shade-loving crops to grow under trees, and it looks very attractive. But its economy is actually dependent on the low labour costs and the fact that you've got a very shade-tolerant plant. And so you want to be careful about these idealistic systems where you're cropping underneath trees, and think about what makes that work in some places and what will undermine it in others. But so explore some of that in more detail. I've got some other examples of joint production functions. There is an argument that timber production just does not work on industrial type timber production doesn't work on farms, because small scale forestry, it becomes too expensive and unviable to harvest. So unless a farmer is prepared to put a large block of trees in, it's not worth growing any trees at all, because you just can't get the return. It's too expensive to do a combination of agriculture and forestry at small scale. My argument is that these people are talking about a system that's already designed to work at a large scale being applied at a small scale. We need to change that notion and say, I want you to explore how you can redesign the forestry to suit the scale in which it's actually working, to suit the landholders who are actually involved, to suit the farming system adjacent to it. So we're designing new systems, not just promoting existing systems out there. Many examples of that conflict: incompatible systems, and I've just put a couple of examples in, a few trees causing real problems. But let's look at allelopathy. This is where a tree has a complete negative effect on crops or plants growing in its vicinity. And the most famous examples of allelopathy is the black walnut tree. And this goes back to the first papers on allelopathy in 1925 that looked at a walnut tree on a farm in North America, and they noticed that the lucerne crop, alfalfa, which wouldn't grow in the vicinity of the walnut. This is the size of the walnut here, the canopy, that's the trunk in the middle, and there was no alfalfa or what we call lucerne growing in that vicinity at all. And they discovered that this is where the roots of the tree expanded to. You can see a root coming out here. They also found that this is tomato plants in a research trial, plots close to a walnut tree, black walnut tree, and there was no tomato plants viable in that vicinity. And this led to this concept of allelopathy, which is a negative of positive companion planting, really. And they found years later, I think it was in the 50s, that the walnut tree eludes a chemical from the roots, which was named juglone before it was even discovered. Juglone's based on juglone based on juglans, the genus name, which causes death to some plants. Not all plants. In some cases, you get very good grass production underneath walnut trees of plant species that aren't susceptible in some way. So this is just an example where combination is a total fail. If you want to grow lucerne and walnuts, black walnuts, you separate the trees, and the same with apples and tomatoes and other things in the example. This is just shows a photo of black walnut trees on a farm in Victoria, our own farm as well. There's separate to this. We have no problem with grass production under black walnuts and the benefits. So there's some good papers on which species actually work and which don't work under black walnut, as just one example of that competitive effect. So when we do a design project, what we're looking for is doing a good diagnosis and then building up a unique and elegant design that reflects the issues in the landscape and the farming systems and all the things that go to it. One of my great satisfactions in working with the farming community in our area, that every farm is different. And to me, this is what farmers are doing on every farm is a little bit different. And that to me reflects the fact that they've actually started exploring, not copying each other, not copying a system they saw on the neighbours, but they're saying, where do I want trees initially for the short-term benefits, and how can I manage them for the long-term benefits of biodiversity, timber and aesthetics or something else like that. And these unique designs are more likely to be actively managed They're more likely to be lower risk for the landholders involved, and they're more likely to encourage a continuous and progressive landscape change over a region, because each subsequent landholder can say, I might be able to adapt that system to suit my particular scenario, rather than just look at the negatives and say, well, I don't like your system because it only works with sheep and I've got cattle, so I'm not going to plant any trees. Well, that's ridiculous in a way, because there may be a way to actually redesign the system so it suits cattle and not sheep in some way. So the design approaches, I've got a few examples here of methods or techniques that might be useful if you're doing it. And it really depends on the nature of your project, the scale you're working at, and what resources. Andrew Stewart alluded to farm planning using mappings, and he talked about how the student in the early part of this course, back in the 90s, rode a horse around the property with Andrew with an aerial photograph and started marking on the map where they could do that. So this mapping procedure is really useful because we're dealing with landscapes. It talked about separating the land into its land units or capabilities, jotting down where the current water courses are and the current roads, and starting alluding to future plans for that. This is a really useful method, mapping, documenting, but not the idea of an architectural plan that'll be fixed for a long period of time. It's starting to read the landscape and interpret what's there and start exploring on a map with an overlay, plastic overlay maybe, to explore what it might look like over time. Andrew's map from the 1990s is really useful because you can compare it with what actually happened, and you can see it was crucial about helping them get started, but it didn't lock them in. They were able to adapt as they build up knowledge over time. And that's one of the things you want to start looking at. The limitations of doing things on maps alone is that it's hard to explore a market on a map, the market for different products and services, to understand the biodiversity and other issues. So having some notes associated with a mapping exercise is really important. Just look up whole farm planning. There's a lot of different examples. Another way of thinking about this, and Andrew alluded to this too in his presentation, is the analog system. Andrew referred to the fact of looking back at what the landscape looked like before European settlement to understand what sort of tree cover it could withstand, how tall the trees were, the types of species, what factors impacted the landscape, to understand the biodiversity and the water as it traveled through the system. And then he hopes, by introducing deep-rooted perennials into his farming system, to mimic what used to be there. It's analog of what used to be there. It sort of has the same functions, even though it's not the same species. For example, well, in this area there used to be a eucalypt forest with kangaroos underneath. Well, he could have a tree component with sheep grazing underneath as analog to that system in some way. The home gardens in the tropics of Java are another good example. They look like a tropical rainforest, but they're made up of productive plants at all different layers, from the ground layer, the medium layer. So they're analog of a tropical rainforest, and it reflects the fact that that environment, the soils and the rainfall and the light, can actually carry a much more complex, diverse landscape in some way. So analog systems is a way of mimicking natural systems. So in your diagnosis, you could explore what used to be there. What is the natural system? And how does that inform some of your design work in some way? Limitations? Well, I worry that people who focus on analog are actually missing the point. Things have changed in many ways. Their scope is limited, to not open to new ideas. They seem only focused on making something look like what it was in the past, rather than saying, well, there may be an argument for a total change. And what happens if the site characteristics have changed? Dryland salinity, exposure, the water tables have risen, fertilizers have been added. There's a lot, and most importantly, we have a totally different economy and population density and land ownership. And in an area where maybe people used to live by moving through the landscape, now we've got family farms settled in one location. So it's very hard to be analog if some of these things have changed over time. Flow diagrams are really important. I keep thinking of Andrew's examples here, moving stock through the landscape. A lot of activities in in a farm actually involve moving through the landscape. If it's the harvesting of trees, it's the collection and moving of trees, wood out of the system. Flow diagrams can be useful for understanding how things could be put together. So Andrew's property, they've got the shearing shed and the shelter area for the off shear sheep. Clearly they're linked with a laneway, so you can think of the shearing shed here and the shelter area here. It's about that connection and then taking the animals out into the larger paddocks. In this case here, it's the harvesting of trees, transporting them, storing them, and then selling them into the operation. So wherever a product is there, just ask the question, is there a flow diagram? Can that inform the relative location or sequencing of these sites in the landscape? It could be the flow of genes through and biodiversity through the landscape and across different ecotones to think about. These are just models to help us understand how we might operate. Observation and analysis. Understanding dryland salinity, understanding soil fertility and carbon moving, understanding some of these, describing what's actually happening and try to ask questions. So looking at a landscape, you might see some soil erosion, analyze it, understand the process involved, what's leading to that, because this can actually highlight at which point you might be able to change the outcome by changing some of the elements of the process, such as we talked about with controlling tunnel erosion, for example, or any of those, or dryland salinity. A lot of these ideas have been drawn from Bill Mollison's book, who's a co-originator of permaculture. And in permaculture, there was a lot about design. I'm really quite interested in how permaculture was supposed to be a design science, and it ended up being some sort of idealistic multi-combination of crops. Well, if it's a design exercise, you shouldn't be able to look at the final outcome and say, that looks like permaculture. Permaculture should just be the outcome of a sensible design process, which is the discussion I've had with David and others, David Holmgren, who was also involved over the years. But Bill had some really good ways, Bill and David had some really good ways to focus on the design. And one of them was to look at the zone and sectors. So here we've got the house. They talked about the herb garden being very close to the kitchen, for example. You don't put your herb garden out in the paddock. They talk about zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and thinking about where do you put various parts based on the energy requirements, the movement of animals and stock and resources through that, and their location with regard to some of the sectors. And the sectors he talks about are where the wind comes from, where the fire threat comes from, and where the sun comes in, and you start thinking about these zones and sectors. It's a really good concept in terms of understanding the placement and the relative advantage of putting things close or further apart, and how close to the center of a farming system, or it's the shearing shed, and you should have some of these things. So that's another way of dealing with the sectors he referred to. And the zones come together here, simplified version. We talked about fire coming from certain directions, winter sun coming in from it. You know, I live in a passive solar house here. It's very important which direction the sun comes in during winter to keep us warm. In summer, we're worried about where the bushfires might come from. Right now, it's freezing cold with winds coming in from the southwest, so we want to shelter elements from that. And these added the fire sector here for the northerly hot summer winds coming in here, then close to the house and further away. So you start thinking about in sector 4 on this side, I might want to put a fire sensitive forest or a fire promoting forest that provides shelter, but it's only produced for timber, and I only go there occasionally, so it can be a long way away. It would have biodiversity values because you don't want biodiversity close to your veggie garden. You don't want all those animals eating your crops in some way. So that's a way of looking at it. The other thing permaculture alluded to was about associations. Asking questions. Say if you had stock, went to a house in Switzerland where the dairy cows were actually in the basement, and they provided heat to heat the house, which you lived above the stock in some way. So you start asking questions. If you want conservation and you want production, should you put them close together or far apart? If you've got chickens and vegetables, do you want them close together or further apart? How do you actually separate or overlap them in some way? And that's essentially asking the question. be quite good. And I've got one of the questions here is, why not harvest trees from a land conservation planting? And it seems that people either come to that from a preconceived idea that conservation and production should be totally separate. What we're exploring is about what happens when you put conservation and production closer together and look for those complementarities in that and assembly in some way. I've put all of this together using a concept of diagnosis and design, and this is really the framework we're encouraging you to do for your project work. Pick a farm, pick a farmer, pick a location, pick a farming enterprise. Identify that group, do the diagnosis step before you even talk about the trees or the crops or anything like that. Develop a shopping list that then you can go back and say, I'm going to look at some of the production systems, some of the products, and explore that. Do a consumer diagnosis. If you're selling products, whether it's flowers, bush food, timber, or some meat off the farm or something, look at what the market actually wants in terms of that. And this could be down to producing carbon neutral lamb off the property and saying, well, what those product specifications are and how can I use that to feed back into the design in some way. And I put it together in this diagram that I hope helps you. Look at the farmers, aspirations, concern, resources, interest. Look at some of the understanding the problems and explore the process that explains the problem, whether it's a shelter problem or biodiversity. Explore some of the research and ask the question, what role might trees or forests play to solve that problem? And then you get design criteria and performance measures. How will the farmer actually judge whether or not the solution is going to suit them in some way? You could do the same thing with consumers. Wherever there is a product produced or a consumer who's buying it, even a government who's influencing discussion on that, there may be a consumer that you want to explore. And when we look at some of the timber markets next week or a couple of weeks' time, you'll see that there are actually market specifications for different products and how they can be actually produced. And then you get this production targets, modes and rewards, such as if there is a carbon market, how do they judge and measure the carbon? How do they reward the landholder? And then you come to the design process. Can we put some of the tree-related production systems together with this and come up with a design and evaluate that against the farmer considerations? So essentially it's a two-step or three-step project. Look at do the diagnosis of the farmers and the diagnosis of the production systems and the consumers, and then put it together in the design decision making. These are the important things they'll be looking at. Once you've done that, you can actually, there's a bit of science there. There's a bit of evaluation into products, and there's a bit on that with regard to the production systems that might work that will feed into the design. So keep this handy and see if it helps break down your project into something which is conceivable. It shouldn't be a huge project. It really comes down to putting a fence around and defining what you need to achieve or what you can achieve without starting doing a huge project that takes many weeks and more research and interviews. The advantage of this approach is that it avoids going in with a best bet or pet system that you're trying to promote. It's a bottom-up approach. It's not biased towards particular outcomes, and it should have a strong market focus because you're looking at what the consumer wants, what the market wants in terms of wood products, quality, with species, flower types, carbon prices, and all that sort of stuff. And it should actually be appropriate to the paddock, farm, and the catchment that you're actually dealing with. It'll pop out questions. It'll raise questions. Can you harvest trees from a riparian buffer without undermining biodiversity? Those questions can be brought to the surface through this process and provide something for you to go and explore, something to identify as an unknown that you can say, well, we don't know, so we're going to take a risk-averse approach to that, and it can feed into those research projects in the future. The limitations, it is a procedure. People would argue that where's the substance? Just go out there and plant trees. And maybe it highlights the complexity of the combinations rather than just providing simple best bets. But I would argue that the complexity is not necessarily a bad thing if it reduces risk and uncertainty, engages people. I'm going to finish this little session on with a review of a conceptual framework for agroforestry, something I worked on while in North America for a period of time, thinking about what can actually help me understand where and how to work with the farming community to fit trees in, what research needs a requirement, and what are required, and how can we work forward. The first point comes down to the definition. You'll see through all of this is if you define what we're talking about with regard to tree growing by the actual system that you're trying to promote, agroforestry is a combination of trees with pasture underneath or something, you're actually missing some of the opportunities. So what we try to do is focus on farm forestry or tree growing, agroforestry, or whatever we call it, land care, is about the farmers engaging alone or in partnership towards the management of trees and forests on their land for the reasons that are important to them. So that's opening up and saying, let's not go into this with a predefined outcome in mind. Let's see what happens when we invest in people and design and work through that. The decision making, what's required, landholders will perceive, they will want to change and be willing to change and able to change. Change is ultimately what we're looking for in many landscapes, to solve past problems and adapt to new ones. And in doing so, we're going to have to think about that change. How big is the step? And we're talking about with that joint production function, where's the opportunity to do the first tree to be planted in some ways? Farmers will say, researchers will just allude to the fact that people will change if they're uncomfortable with where they are and they're confident about moving to that next level in some fashion. So what do we need? What matters? It matters what farmers think, what their aspirations, needs, how they measure success, and what's constraining and what they're facing as risks. And these are the sort of things we want you to explore a little bit through the diagnosis, in terms of, if we can understand this, then we can help people identify that first step. My second point is about those consumers or stakeholders, government, industry, and others who want to see change in the farming landscape. We include ourselves in this as well, with looking at a degraded landscape and wanting to seek change. Our interests as the non-farmer are just as important, and we can start thinking about how we can start influencing what farmers do in their commitment to the landscape. So who are the stakeholders? Those whose opinion or welfare the farmer values are important, those who set and enforce the laws and community norms, and those who provide services and support to the farmer, and those who purchase and receive the goods. We might all, many different people fall into it. A friend or neighbour or a tax consultant or an agricultural advisor might be in category one. Government and industry and local government who define the laws are clearly a stakeholder, because they influence what landholders are allowed to do or what they're encouraged to do. Providers of services, nurserymen, consultants, community groups who are trying to support the farmer, and those who are actually advocating for particular outcomes, whether it be environmental, economic, or social outputs, both good and bad, and that's an interesting one. Water quality outcomes off the farm, timber produced off the farming landscape. The important thing is, to me, is how we all operate together. Here's a little map of a farmer making a decision. It's a conceptual map based on some research done in New Zealand and dairy farmers. There's the decision maker in the middle. And then there's various stakeholders around them. In the first ring are the intimates, the family members, the people they trust, the people they talk with regularly, the friends and neighbours and admirers, farmers. As a professional stakeholder, you're unlikely to be in the inner circle in that regard. Out here we have industry groups, the people who buy the products off the farm currently, neighbours a bit further away, the things people read and learn and engage from. And way out here we have the researchers and government, industry and other groups. All these lines indicate where all the messages and influences travel between them. So you might influence what a farmer decides by actually working directly with other people who are able to influence the landholder. It's the complexity of the conversation and the decision-making process. And I add this because so many people in government think if they change the law here or they change the market, farmers will respond, and they totally disregard the fact that there's a conversation going on within the community and within the family, and that will affect how these outer things are interpreted. So it's not enough to do research and publish a journal article. It's not going to change anything in that. The types of stakeholders I've separated in outcome orientated. They're the consumers who really care about what product or what the water quality is or whether the biodiversity increases, and the process orientated ones, the one who is trying to help the farmer benefit themselves. So in a community of peer mentors, it doesn't matter to us as mentors whether this farmer plants a tree for timber or not. We're trying to help them make a decision that's best for them. Whereas the timber company do care if the farmer plants trees for timber or not, because that's their particular outcome. So these consumers have quite different ways of operating, and they get trusted differently by the farming community. If we can increase the number of people who are supporters of the farmer, who they can trust, and then build up from that trust confidence in some of the products and services that might be provided for out here, we'll develop that. But it's not enough to just say, provide a program to support biodiversity without having these trusted supporters in the landscape as well. My third point, you can influence what happens on a farm in many different ways. And this is important. Stakeholders have to identify what type of stakeholder they are, and then think about how they can change what actually happens in the landscape. You can change the balance of factors that influence the farmer's decisions, the stimuli. If the market for timber doubles, farmers may be more interested. You could change that. If the carbon price increases, that may change things. If a law comes in that farmers have to be carbon neutral in their production system, that will change. You don't have to directly work with individual farmers, but the stakeholders and government agencies can change factors that influence farmer decisions. Then the next point is you can change the reaction of the farmers to the existing set of stimuli. How do they react? If you provide education, guidance, mentoring, you're not changing the stimuli, because as mentors, we can't affect the price or the laws, but we can change how the farmer reacts to that by their understanding or their position in that. Or finally, you can change the farmers themselves. Old farmers can leave the land, young farmers can come in. You can change and provide rules about who can farm or how you can access farm and stuff like that. And this point's often overlooked, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to encourage older farmers to leave the land and pass the land on to younger ones, and maybe that would actually result in a change in the landscape in some fashion. Changing farmer attitudes. This is a really interesting thing. If someone comes out and says, I'm going to change your attitude, what's your reaction? You're going to be defensive straight away. And if you start saying to farmers, we don't like the way you're farming, we think you should change, that's not really going to be a good way to entice change in the landscape. So my final point is having an opportunity to make or influence how land management decisions are done carries an ethical responsibility to society and to the land. And this builds on some ethics work that's been done and explored about land ethics in some fashion. Ethics, it's about antisocial behavior. It's about what's right and wrong above and beyond some of the rules and the laws and stuff like that. And for this, I allude back to some early work by Aldo Leopold. And if you've got a chance to read up, there's some online writings that you can read about. He talks about land ethics as the thing that is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the community. And he was talking about land. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. We have in our farming systems clearly production systems in so many places around the world where farmers are able to degrade their landscape, clear the forest, to destroy biodiversity without any penalty. And whether that requires laws to come in, or whether we can build on this notion of a land ethics to actually influence some of that. Aldo also talks about ways of changing that and thinks about intelligent tinkering. When you're designing systems, we don't have the knowledge to actually say, know exactly what might come out of it, but we know that we can tinker with some of the systems. We can do a little bit of work around the edges and work out how we can get some advantages in the way we design systems. You don't have to have perfect knowledge in terms of designing farm management systems. In fact, we don't. Very few farmers know exactly. But in terms of changing landscape management, being careful not to intervene too much that you could actually destroy what we don't understand about the landscape. And he talks about intelligent tinkering being to keep every cog in the wheel of a machine, and precaution of an intelligent tinkerer. Being careful, even if you don't understand how the system entirely works, just start doing a little bit of this. And now we're doing this in the way we manage our riparian buffer strips or manage some of the biodiversity. Act and observe, but don't take big steps at once before in case something goes wrong. And I'm going to finish with this sort of intelligent tinkering concept. You've probably all seen kids roll their tyres down a hill, bumping with a stick. And thinking, when you plant trees, the trees grow. And they've got trees in the back on this farm in East Timor where I was. You plant the trees and they will grow. The intelligent tinkering is just to manipulate the growth as it occurs and direct the growing system the way you want to take it. So in that sense, the most important thing is not the recipe about what to do when. It's having people involved in managing these farms that are able to observe and adapt their management to direct the growth, who understand what the market's looking for and can take that plant towards where it provides the best outcome for the market. When I talk about markets, I'm talking about biodiversity as much as timber production in that way. And in that concept, it's about the knowledge and experience of the landholder. And this is an old white guy. He's not as good in doing it. And in that sense, providing education, mentoring support, access to research, the license to tinker is going to be a very important step in that. So I hope that helps with the design process. And in doing that, think about your project, look at that design diagnosis as design graph, and think if you can use any of these conceptual models of joint production functions or zones and permaculture to try and think about how you can start designing a system. Don't be too focused on having a perfect plan. Very much think about what improving the outcome for the decisions that people are going to be making in the short term, while keeping the long-term options open in some way. And in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about those long-term options in regard to the economics of tree growing for capital gain on a farm. Thank you.